Hi, my name is Parker Gilbert,
And I'm Vance Swett.
and we're going to be presenting today on voting rights in the United States and how to build a civil rights movement around improving minorities' ability to vote.
There are three restrictive voting laws that unduly affect minorities. The first of which is felony disenfranchisement. Currently, there are 1.4 million African American men who are currently disenfranchised and no longer have the right to vote. This rate is 7 times the national average.
The disproportionate minority contact that the entire criminal justice system has here in the United States makes it impossible for felon disenfranchisement to not disproportionately affect minorities. 38.2% of the prison population in the United States is made up of black individuals, while only 12.6% of the population is African American. The felon disenfranchisement statistics in Florida, Kentucky, and Virginia are particularly staggering. More than 1 in 5 black adults in these states cannot vote because of prior felony convictions.
The second area is restrictive voter ID laws. These restrictive voter ID laws are based on the scare of voter fraud. However, numerous studies have found that voter fraud has a negligible effect on national polling.
One specific instance where voter ID appears very biased is in Texas, where military IDs and gun permits are acceptable as forms of IDs at the polls, but state government and student IDs are not. And these are the types of forms of IDs which are more commonly held by minority citizens. We will now delve into how to create a social movement that will garner sufficient power to make real reform. While the federal government holds the key to national reform in the long run, we believe that currently lobbying them is futile. The political climate is simply not responsive to passing any new policies, let alone voting rights reform. We must instead focus on pushing state legislators for progress, just as the women's suffrage movement did in winning the right to vote in 12 states before successfully petitioning Congress for what is now the 19th Amendment. This state-by-state approach will have 2 different paths. Firstly, we want to make any litigation of restricting voting rights the center of the national movement. We want to emphasize the importance of these events, and they will provide a tangible focal point for campaigns. Secondly, we want to push for novel approaches and progress in liberal states. We will attempt to set new precedents where there is as little resistance as possible. And 2 focuses of this path will be felon enfranchisement and the utilization of new technology. We believe North Carolina would be the ideal place to start this state-by-state approach for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there is already a strong grassroots campaign here. The North Carolina NAACP chapter has led a series of well-attended and passionate Moral Monday protests for the past couple of years where voting rights have been a central theme. And just recently, on June 17th, state NAACP leader Reverend William Barber and 9 other protesters were arrested while protesting about voting reform. This grassroots movement is strong enough to support a national campaign, and by bringing an influx of people from out of state, we can really up the power and up the media worthiness of these events. Secondly, there's momentum to build upon. Recently in North Carolina, legislators are currently backpedaling from the extensive voting reforms that they passed in 2013 after they lost their pre-clearance requirements. The extremity of the legislation that they passed included strict voter ID requirements, a reduction in early voting by a week, and the elimination of same-day registration. And, as the table shows, research by Democracy North Carolina, which is a nonpartisan research center, found that their new policies resulted in likely a reduction of 30,000 voters in the 2014 midterm elections. And while African Americans accounted for 22% of the registered voters, they accounted for 38% of the provisional ballots that were rejected because of changes in the voting laws. Now, ideally, the upcoming court case in North Carolina results in a victory for the voting rights activists. However, we believe a loss in court can still be turned into a victory for this movement. If we can put enough attention, enough anticipation, and enough importance around the verdict of this case, we can incite a high level of indignation with a loss that could embolden other movements around the country. There could be a level of civil disobedience and outrage that hasn't been attached to voting rights reform in a long, long time, since the 60s. And we believe that either way this verdict goes, we can still use this to our advantage. So how are we going to mobilize people from around the country to travel to North Carolina to participate in voting protests? Well, we believe that right now there are a handful of opportunities, and I'm just going to speak about two of them. Firstly, we can utilize the fact that 2015 is the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. We believe that tying protests by playing off of the names, by evoking a sense of history, the importance of what happened in the 60s, and tying that to this push today, we can lend a sense of legitimacy and a desire for people to take part in it that otherwise might not have. It's the 50th anniversary of the historic march, yet we still don't have minorities enfranchised the way that we should, and we believe that is a huge opportunity to inspire people to take part in these reforms. Secondly, we can market the protest as an outlet for anyone incensed by the recently racially motivated hate crimes. There are going to be people out there who are upset by the status of the racial equilibrium in the states, and also people who are frustrated that these recent hate crimes could be considered representative, and they want to do what they can to prove that they're not. So now we get back to how we move this national movement once the protests in North Carolina have come to a climax. And we get back to what we originally talked about with these two paths. Firstly, we want to target litigation surrounding restrictive voting laws. Specifically, Texas and Arizona have upcoming court cases pending. There's also ongoing legislation in New Hampshire which might be worthy events to try and capitalize off of and create national media attention around. Secondly, we want to target progressive states with liberal governments where we can make the most progress on setting new precedents and adopting novel reforms. We think one area in particular could be liberal states which have particularly strict felon disenfranchisement laws right now. Particularly Rhode Island, Washington, and Delaware come to mind. We also think there are opportunities in Massachusetts and Oregon where they already have relatively lenient felon enfranchisement laws to actually push for full disenfranchisement. Lastly, and Vance will talk about this more, we think there are opportunities to promote technology reform, specifically online voter registration, in progressive states.
So one of the recent introductions to the U.S. elections platform has been online voter registration, and we think it's going to be a great first step to take. It's greatly beneficial because it re-enfranchises those voters who become frustrated with the system. And there are numerous benefits and key components that it adds to the election process. First and foremost, it greatly reduces the cost for state election committees. For example, in Arizona, the first state to create such a platform, they saw a decrease in labor costs of 80 cents for each online registration. Since then, there has been roughly 325,000 of those transactions, which represents a major cost saving. And this key component alone may prove to be essential when we begin to press the issue into more traditional states. However, more importantly, and kind of getting to the meat of the issue, by allowing online registration, you are lowering barriers. The Act allows those voters with constraints like disabilities or a lack of time an option available from home 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. And not only does it lower barriers because you can register from home, but it also reduces the amount of time spent in line waiting to vote. This is greatly beneficial to those whose time constraints are a major deterrent to voting. This is especially true of those who cannot afford to miss work or are currently working multiple jobs. And it is often these individuals who are cited as being disenfranchised in the recent voter reform. Also, another element is by registering online, the amount of provincial ballots filed is substantially lessened. In the traditional system, errors made while transcribing paper registration forms and inputting them into electronic platforms were common. This system alleviates the issue by allowing voters to input their information directly, greatly increasing accuracy. This also reduces congestion at the polling place and greatly speeds up the process, making voting a more streamlined and pleasant experience. These tools alone help improve the voter experience, which in turn increases voter participation. Just another subset of online registration is that 4 states have adopted opening up the system to be used on mobile phones, thus enabling those people without access to a computer and other outlet to become registered without traveling and waiting at registration stations. So back to our issue. Currently, there are numerous states that have recently enacted legislation that limits access to the polls, which often cites stricter registration practices. So harkening back to the example used earlier, the state of North Carolina, the House Bill 589 and the subsequent court case, the North Carolina NAACP versus McCrory, the bill made numerous changes to the voting process. The 4 mentioned earlier were that it limits early voting to 1 week, it terminated same-day registration, it eliminated pre-registration for 16 or 17-year-olds, and it excludes provisional ballots if placed in the wrong districts. Online registration alone would largely nullify 3 of the 4 major points of contention with the bill. It eliminates the problem with same-day registration. It helps dissuade problems with pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds because it's an easy step for them to do online. Arizona, for example, Arizona saw an increase of 29% to 53% of voters between the ages of 18 and 24 after the adoption of the online voter registration. And like we mentioned earlier, it helps alleviate errors in the rolls that would lead to ballots being placed in the wrong districts. This bill alone has been largely lambasted by voting rights reform groups as being an unfair burden on voters that largely targets minorities and the poor. By simply adding online registration, we can ease some of those burdens. So, moving forward, we would like to push for online voter registration in every state across the country. Simply by providing another avenue to register, voting becomes easier and less complicated than before. Currently, there have been 20 states that have adopted online voter registration, and it has proven to be largely successful. Since the repeal of Section 5 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, citizens across the country have faced increased scrutiny at polling places, and voting has become a laborious process that unduly affects those in lower economic standing and minorities.
We hope we've convinced you that the solution lies in a national campaign first targeting states. By disrupting and inspiring civil disobedience around new restrictive laws, we will attempt to improve voting rights and inspire support for more novel approaches.
Enacting online voter registration provides a good first step to re-enfranchise those who have been unnecessarily plagued by recent legislation, and the right to vote will once again become a real possibility for all citizens.